Brooke Logan did not enter Katie's office that day expecting history to fracture. She came armed with questions, sharpened by weeks of quiet suspicion and a simmering sense of betrayal that refused to be soothed. By reason, the revelation that Eric Forrester had been secretly working for the Logan fashion line, quietly advising, subtly shaping, and strategically strengthening a rival brand, had unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. It was not merely the act itself that stung but the symbolism. Eric, the patriarch whose legacy had defined Forrester Creations for decades, had crossed an invisible line. He had lent his genius, his credibility, to a name that stood opposite the empire he built. Brooke told herself she sought clarity, not confrontation, yet her footsteps carried the weight of accusation long before she reached the door. Katie's office felt unusually still, the air heavy with an unnatural quiet that pressed against Brooke's senses. The space, typically alive with movement and intent, seemed paused, as though time itself had hesitated. Brooke's eyes scanned the room, noting the details she would later replay endlessly. The angled light through the blinds, the faint hum of distant traffic, the smell of polished wood and something sharper beneath it. She called out Eric's name once, then again, irritation giving way to unease. When she stepped further inside, the truth revealed itself not with drama but with devastating simplicity. Eric Forrester lay motionless near his desk, his body angled in a way that suggested collapse rather than rest. Nearby, a heavy object, its purpose benign until that moment, rested ominously close, as though the room itself were pointing toward it. Shock did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, numbing Brooke's limbs, narrowing her vision. She knelt instinctively, searching for signs of life she already knew would not be there. Eric's presence, so commanding in life, now felt impossibly fragile. In that instant, Brooke's anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing grief. The questions she had carried dissolved into one unbearable certainty. The man who had shaped generations, who had been both adversary and ally, was gone, and she was the one who had found him. The arrival of the police fractured the silence with procedural urgency. Lights flashed, radios crackled, and the room filled with unfamiliar voices cataloging the scene. Brooke answered questions in a daze, her words measured yet hollow, each sentence an effort to remain upright in a reality that no longer made sense. The heavy object was photographed, bagged, its proximity to Eric's body immediately raising implications no one dared to voice aloud. Accidents were considered, of course, but the room resisted innocence. There was no obvious sign of struggle, yet the alignment of details suggested intent, or at least conflict, had preceded the moment. As investigators began assembling a preliminary list of persons of interest, the narrative around Eric's final days emerged with unsettling clarity. His decision to help Katie's Logan brand had not occurred in isolation. It had ignited tensions that rippled through the family, reopening old wounds about loyalty, control, and legacy. Brooke's recent confrontations with Eric, once private and emotional, now took on a darker resonance. Her presence at the scene, her known opposition to Eric's choice, positioned her uncomfortably close to suspicion. She understood this with painful lucidity, recognizing how easily motive could be constructed from fragments of truth. Ridge Forrester's name surfaced almost as quickly, carried by the same undercurrents of conflict. His disputes with Eric over the future of Forrester Creations had grown increasingly sharp, fueled by the belief that Eric's actions undermined the very foundation of the company. To Ridge, Eric's collaboration with Katie had not been an act of creativity but a betrayal, one that threatened the balance of power and the integrity of the brand. The timing of Eric's death, so soon after these clashes, transformed family discord into potential criminal narrative. Grief and guilt blurred together as Ridge confronted the horrifying possibility that words spoken in anger could now be weaponized against him. The investigation unfolded methodically, yet every step felt personal. Offices were searched, schedules reconstructed, conversations revisited with forensic precision. Brooke replayed her final exchanges with Eric, searching for clues she might have missed, tones that lingered too long, silences that now felt weighted with meaning. She wondered whether Eric had sensed danger, whether his choice to work quietly had been driven by more than creative curiosity. Doubt crept in, not only about others, but about herself. Could anger, once contained, have manifested in ways she could no longer fully account for? The question haunted her, not because she believed she was capable of violence, but because memory is a fragile witness under the strain of trauma. Katie, devastated by the loss of an ally she had trusted implicitly, found herself entangled in the consequences of Eric's decision. The Logan brand, once buoyed by the promise of Eric's guidance, now stood exposed to scrutiny and suspicion. What had begun as a professional collaboration had become a focal point in a murder investigation. Katie grappled with the unbearable weight of responsibility, questioning whether her ambition had inadvertently placed Eric in harm's way. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that her success might now be framed as motive by those seeking answers too quickly. As the days passed, the Forrester family closed ranks, not out of unity but necessity. The loss of Eric created a vacuum no one was prepared to fill. Meetings were cancelled, then rescheduled, each agenda overshadowed by whispered speculation and wary glances. The future of Forrester Creations hung in a precarious balance. Its leadership questioned at the very moment stability was most needed. Investors watched closely, rivals waited, and within the family, trust eroded under the relentless pressure of investigation. Brooke and Ridge, bound by history as much as by suspicion, faced an impossible reckoning. Their shared grief collided with the awareness that either could become the narrative's villain, depending on how facts were interpreted. They spoke carefully now, every word weighed for how it might sound in a report. Love, once a refuge, became complicated by the fear that proximity itself could be misread. In private moments, Brooke mourned not only Eric, but the loss of certainty, the belief that family conflict, however fierce, would never culminate in irrevocable harm. The police, for their part, followed the evidence with disciplined neutrality. Motive, opportunity, and means were examined without sentiment. The heavy object found near Eric remained a central focus, its origin and placement dissected in search of clarity. Was it a tragic coincidence? A misstep in a moment of distress? Or the final punctuation of an argument gone too far? Each possibility carried implications that threatened to reshape lives. As suspicion lingered, the community surrounding Forrester Creations felt the tremors. Long-standing alliances wavered, old grievances resurfaced. The story of Eric Forrester, visionary, patriarch, provocateur, was being rewritten in real time, filtered through the lens of tragedy and doubt. Those who loved him struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the circumstances of his death. In the end, what remained was an unresolved tension that refused to settle neatly into answers. Eric's death was not merely an event. It was a catalyst, exposing the fault lines beneath decades of ambition and devotion. Brooke stood at the center of it all, bearing the weight of discovery and the burden of suspicion, her grief inseparable from the questions that followed her every step. Ridge, too, confronted a future shaped by loss and the knowledge that legacy can become liability without warning. The office where Eric was found would never be just an office again. It became a threshold between past and future, innocence and accountability, love and consequence. And as the investigation pressed forward, one truth grew impossible to ignore. In a world built on passion and power, the line between betrayal and tragedy can be devastatingly thin. Brooke Logan had always believed that truth, no matter how painful, could eventually restore balance. That belief was tested the moment she found herself seated beneath harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by the quiet machinery of law enforcement. Her every word weighed for meaning beyond intention. The police questioning began politely, almost gently, but it did not remain that way for long. Grief clung to Brooke like a second skin, yet it offered no protection against suspicion. To the investigators, sorrow was not proof of innocence. It was merely another emotion to be dissected, another layer to peel back in the search for motive. At first, Brooke denied everything. She spoke of shock, of heartbreak, of the unbearable image of Eric Forrester lying lifeless in the office that had once symbolized creativity and legacy. She described her visit as accidental, driven by unanswered questions rather than rage. But denial, when pressed, has a way of revealing its own fractures. As the questioning intensified, fragments of truth began to surface. Not because Brooke wished to confess to wrongdoing, but because she could no longer deny the depth of her anger. The investigators listened carefully as her composure faltered, as the carefully constructed wall around her emotions began to crack. Brooke admitted what she had long tried to suppress: the betrayal she felt upon discovering that Eric had secretly helped Katie build the Logan brand in direct opposition to her. This was not merely a business slight. To Brooke, it was a deeply personal wound. Eric had never been just a collaborator or a corporate figurehead. He had been family in every sense that mattered. A paternal presence woven into the fabric of her life and her identity. Learning that he had worked against her, quietly, deliberately, felt like a violation of trust that extended far beyond fashion or profit. It was as though the ground beneath her had shifted, revealing that the legacy she believed she shared was never as solid as she thought. The police seized on this revelation, their questions sharpening with renewed focus. They suggested that Brooke's anger had not been fleeting, that it had driven her to Eric's office with confrontation in mind. The image they painted was disturbingly plausible. Brooke arriving with emotions already inflamed, demanding answers, refusing to accept explanations. In this version of events, words escalated, tempers flared, and a moment of uncontrolled fury ended in tragedy. Brooke recoiled at the implication, horrified by the suggestion that her pain could be transformed into violence. Yet the more she protested, the more the investigators circled back to the same point. Rage does not require intent to kill, it only requires a moment where control slips. As Brooke grappled with the weight of these accusations, Ridge Forrester found himself drawn into the center of the storm. Publicly, he stood firmly by his wife, his voice unwavering as he declared Brooke's innocence. To him, the idea that Brooke could harm Eric was unthinkable, an insult to everything she had ever been. Ridge framed her anger as justified but human, something that could never justify suspicion of murder. His defense was passionate, even defiant, and it carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Privately, however, Ridge's position was far more precarious. The police had uncovered evidence placing him in the Forrester building on the night of Eric's death, a detail he could not easily explain away. The revelation sent a ripple of unease through the investigation, complicating a narrative that had begun to focus almost exclusively on Brooke. Ridge's presence raised new questions, ones that struck at the heart of his own fears and secrets. Why had he been there so late? What business remained unresolved after hours? And why had he failed to mention it until confronted? Ridge's possible motives were unsettling in their variety. On one level, his concerns about Eric's actions were deeply professional. Eric's alliance with Katie threatened the power structure at Forrester Creations, undermining Ridge's authority and destabilizing the company at a critical moment. Protecting his position had always been a priority, not out of greed alone, but because Ridge believed himself to be the rightful steward of his family's legacy. Eric's betrayal challenged that belief, forcing Ridge to confront the possibility that the man he revered no longer trusted him to lead. Yet there were darker implications as well. The investigators speculated that Ridge might have known something about Eric, something personal, something damaging, that he did not want Brooke to uncover. Perhaps Ridge had arrived at the building to confront Eric himself, to extract a promise of silence or explanation before Brooke could do the same. The idea that Ridge might have been guarding a secret, rather than simply defending his wife, introduced a new layer of tension that even he struggled to deny. Another possibility haunted Ridge more than any other. What if he had been trying to prevent the very confrontation the police now believed had occurred? What if he had followed Brooke, sensing her distress, hoping to calm her before emotions spiraled out of control? In this scenario, Ridge was not the architect of tragedy but an unwilling participant, someone whose intervention came too late or went disastrously wrong. The thought that his attempt to protect both Brooke and Eric might have inadvertently contributed to Eric's death was almost unbearable. As the investigation unfolded, Brooke and Ridge found themselves trapped in parallel nightmares. Brooke was forced to confront the ugliest interpretation of her grief, watching strangers reframe her love and loyalty as potential motive for murder. Ridge, meanwhile, was torn between transparency and self-preservation, knowing that every detail he revealed could either absolve or condemn the woman he loved. Their shared history, once a source of strength, now complicated every decision, binding them together even as suspicion threatened to tear them apart. The strain took its toll on Brooke in ways she could not easily articulate. She replayed her last moments before entering Eric's office, searching her memory for clarity that refused to emerge. Anger, yes. Pain, unquestionably. But violence? She could not reconcile the idea with the reality of her feelings. And yet doubt crept in. Not because she believed she was capable of murder, but because she understood how fragile memory becomes under emotional strain. The fear that she might not remember everything, might not fully know what happened in the heat of the moment, was perhaps the most terrifying realization of all. Ridge watched Brooke unravel under scrutiny, his own guilt manifesting not from wrongdoing but from helplessness. He had spent his life believing he could fix problems through force of will or decisive action. This was different. No design sketch, no boardroom maneuver, no impassioned speech could undo what had already occurred. The truth, whatever it was, would surface on its own terms, indifferent to loyalty or love. Within Forrester Creations, the impact of Eric's death deepened the sense of instability. Leadership faltered, alliances shifted, and whispers filled the corridors once dominated by confidence. Employees watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of fear and fascination, aware that the outcome could redefine the company's future. Eric's absence loomed large, his influence felt most acutely in the void he left behind. As police pressure mounted, the line between defender and suspect blurred for Ridge. Each effort to protect Brooke risked casting suspicion on himself. Each attempt to explain his presence at the building raised further questions. The possibility that both husband and wife might be entangled in the same tragedy, albeit in different ways, became increasingly difficult to dismiss. In the end, the investigation revealed less about guilt than about vulnerability. Brooke's fury, Ridge's secrecy, Eric's betrayal, all converged in a single night that none of them could undo. Whether the tragedy was born of confrontation, miscalculation, or an entirely different force remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that Eric Forrester's death had shattered more than lives. It had exposed the fragile intersections of love, ambition, and legacy, where devotion can so easily transform into suspicion. As Brooke and Ridge faced the future, bound together by grief and the weight of unanswered questions, they were forced to confront a truth neither had anticipated. In a world built on passion and power, innocence is not always enough to shield the heart from consequence. Sometimes even love becomes evidence, and loyalty itself stands trial in the shadow of loss.